I don't have a single memory of my childhood where I was the center of attention. My sister, Lily, was born prematurely with a complex set of respiratory and immune system issues. The world, for my parents, shrank to the four walls of her hospital room, and then to the sterile, hermetically sealed bubble of our home. I was born 2 years before her, a perfectly healthy, loud, and messy child who needed hugs and scraped knees. But I was a walking biohazard. My parents, in their frantic, all-consuming fear, saw me not as a child, but as a potential source of infection. The house wasn't a home, it was a germ-free zone. My childhood was a series of unspoken rules. Wash your hands constantly. Don't touch Lily. Don't breathe too close to her. Don't bring home germs from school. If I so much as sniffled, I was immediately quarantined to my room, given a stack of books, and told not to come out until my parents were sure I wasn't carrying a new plague. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent, lonely spectator in a life that revolved entirely around my sister's fragile health. Lily's room was a castle, a place of constant attention and love. It was a world of buzzing monitors, whirring humidifiers, and a steady stream of doctors, nurses, and specialists. I would stand outside her door, my small face pressed against the glass, watching my parents dote on her. My mother would read her stories, her voice soft and gentle. My father would hold her small, delicate hand, his face a mask of love and fear. I was on the outside, a lonely figure in the hallway, separated by an invisible barrier that I was never allowed to cross. I tried, of course. I tried to make them notice me. I would draw them pictures, small, clumsy drawings of stick figures and smiling suns. I would leave them on the kitchen table, a silent plea for their attention. They would look at them, a fleeting, absent-minded glance, and then they would put them in a drawer and forget about them. I was a child who needed love, but I was also a child who learned, very quickly, that I was a child who would never get it. I learned to be self-sufficient at a young age. I was a prodigy, not because I was brilliant, but because I had to be. I was a child who craved recognition, and the only way I could get it was through my own achievements. I excelled at school. I was a straight-A student, a quiet, diligent girl who finished her homework before anyone else had even started. I was a star athlete on the track team, a fast, powerful runner who won every race she entered. I was a master of the piano, a quiet, dedicated musician who could play the most complex pieces by ear. I was a child who was building a life, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I would bring home my report cards, my trophies, my medals, my certificates, and I would lay them on the kitchen table, a final, desperate plea for my parents' attention. My mother would look at them, her face a mask of bored indifference. "That's nice, honey," she would say, her voice flat. "But remember to wash your hands before you touch Lily's toys." My father would just nod, his eyes on the TV, his mind a million miles away. My achievements were a mountain of forgotten triumphs, a testament to a life that they had never acknowledged, a life that they had never cared about. I also had a brother, Mark, who was 2 years older than me. He was a bully, a loud, obnoxious boy who was also a golden child. He was not as smart as me, or as athletic, or as musical, but he was a boy, and in my parents' eyes, that was enough. He was a constant, nagging presence, a boy who would steal my awards, tear up my report cards, and mock me for my quiet, solitary pursuits. "You're a nerd," he would say, his voice full of a cruel, mocking bravado. "You're a loser." My parents, of course, were oblivious to his cruelty. They saw him as a normal boy, a boy who was just being a boy. They saw me as a quiet, withdrawn girl who was just being a girl. They saw a family, but I saw a war that I was fighting on my own, a war that I was, for the most part, losing. I was a child who was fighting for her life, but I was also a child who was fighting a silent, desperate battle for her own sanity. The final lesson came when I was 14. I had just won a prestigious academic award, a scholarship to a summer program for gifted students. It was a huge deal, a moment of triumph that I had worked for my entire life. I ran home, a breathless, excited child, and I showed my parents the certificate, my hands shaking. I won. I said, my voice a small, triumphant squeal. I won a scholarship. My father looked at the certificate, his face a mask of quiet indifference. That's nice, honey, he said, his voice flat. But can you do something for us? He then asked me to go to the pharmacy to pick up a special medication for Lily, a medication that was difficult to find and that required a lot of paperwork. I was a child who had just won an award, and I was being asked to go on a quest for my sister. The message was clear. My triumphs, my achievements, my entire life, were not important. Lily's needs, on the other hand, were paramount. It was in that moment, in that final, brutal moment of truth, that I learned the defining lesson of my life. I was on my own. I had to build my own life, my own future, my own happiness. And I had to do it for myself. I was a ghost. I was a shadow. I was a child who had learned to be invisible. So, when I finally left, it was a quiet, unnoticed escape. I was 18, and I had been accepted into a prestigious university on a full-ride scholarship. I packed a single suitcase, a small, worn-out suitcase that was filled with my clothes and my books. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out of the house, a quiet, resolute girl who was finally, truly, free. My parents didn't notice I was gone for 3 days. My father called me, his voice a low, confused growl. Where are you? He demanded. Lily has a doctor's appointment tomorrow. We need you to watch her. I was a grown woman, a woman who had left for college, and I was still being treated like a live-in babysitter. I can't, I said, my voice shaking. I'm at college. I'm busy. He hung up on me. It was the last time I would talk to him for months. I was a ghost in my own home, and now, I was a ghost in my own family. My college life was a revelation. I was a fish out of water, a quiet, withdrawn girl in a world of loud, boisterous, and happy people. I was a person who had never learned how to socialize, how to make friends, how to be happy. But I was also a person who was determined to learn. I joined clubs. I went to parties. I made friends. I was a person who was building a life from scratch, a life that was not defined by my family, a life that was not defined by my past. I also discovered my passion. I was a history major, a quiet, studious girl who loved the past. I would spend hours in the university library, poring over old books, old documents, old pictures. I was a person who was learning to love her own quiet, solitary pursuits, a person who was learning to love herself. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, but I was now a person who was learning to be real. My junior year of college, I found a part-time job at an antique shop, a small, dusty place with a kind, elderly owner named Eleanor. She was a woman who saw me, not as a quiet, withdrawn girl, but as a person who was smart, and curious, and kind. She taught me about the world of antiques, the world of history, the world of beautiful, forgotten things. I learned to identify different eras, different styles, different materials. I learned to look at a piece of jewelry, a small, insignificant thing, and to see a story, a history, a life. Eleanor was a mentor, a person who saw my potential and who helped me to realize it. She taught me that I had a gift for seeing the value in things that others had forgotten. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was learning to be a ghost in the past, a person who was learning to bring old, beautiful things back to life. It was a beautiful, powerful feeling. After college, I got a job at a prestigious auction house in New York City. I was a junior appraiser, a quiet, studious girl in a world of loud, boisterous, and confident people. But I was also a person who had a gift. I had a gift for seeing the value in things that others had forgotten. I had a gift for authenticating vintage jewelry, for seeing the subtle signs of age, the subtle marks of craftsmanship, the subtle clues of a piece's history. I was a person who was a master of her craft, a person who was a master of her own life. I was a ghost in my own home, and now, I was a ghost in a world of wealth and power. I was a person who was learning to navigate a new world, a world of billionaires and socialites and expensive, beautiful things. But I was also a person who was staying true to herself, a person who was staying true to her own quiet, solitary pursuits. I was a person who had learned to be a survivor, and I was now a person who was learning to be a success. I kept my life a secret from my family. I didn't tell them about my job. I didn't tell them about my apartment. I didn't tell them about my friends. I didn't tell them about my happiness. I was a person who had learned to be invisible, and I was a person who was determined to stay that way. I would call them once in a while, a phone call that was always a quiet, painful reminder of my past. My mother would ask me about Lily, her voice full of a nagging, persistent worry. My father would ask me about my job, his voice a low, dismissive grunt. "You're not a doctor, are you?" he would say. "You're not a lawyer, are you?" I would just shake my head, a quiet, defeated gesture. "No," I would say. "I'm just a person who is trying to make a living." They never asked about my happiness. They never asked about my life. They never asked about me. I was a person who had been a ghost in my own home, and I was now a person who was a ghost in my own family. I was a success. My job, which had started as a quiet, solitary pursuit, had turned into a career. I was an expert, a person who was sought after by auction houses and collectors from all over the world. My salary, which had started as a small, insignificant sum, had turned into a fortune. I was a person who had a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of influence. But I was also a person who had a lot of guilt. My family, who had once been a source of my pain, was now a source of my quiet, persistent worry. My sister, Lily, who was now a young woman, was still struggling with her health. My parents were still struggling with her care. My brother, Mark, who was now a man, was still struggling with his life. He was a man who had no job, no money, and no hope. He was a man who was a prisoner of his own entitlement. I couldn't just stand by and watch them struggle. So, I started to help. Anonymously. I would send them money, a small, insignificant sum at first, and then, a larger, more significant sum. I would pay for Lily's medical bills. I would pay for their mortgage. I would pay for Mark's car. I was a ghost, a quiet, benevolent force that was helping them from a distance. I was a person who was a prisoner of her own kindness, a person who was a prisoner of her own past. The anonymous gifts, however, started to raise suspicions. My parents, who had once been so oblivious to my existence, were now a curious, nagging presence in my life. "Who is sending us this money?" my mother would ask, her voice a low, persistent whisper. "Who is paying for Lily's medical bills?" I would just shrug, a quiet, non-committal gesture. "I don't know," I would say. "Maybe it's a charity. Maybe it's a good Samaritan." They would look at me, a flicker of doubt in their eyes, and they would look at my clothes, my shoes, my car. They would see a girl who was not rich, a girl who was not powerful, a girl who was not a success. And they would forget about me again. But the suspicion was there, a quiet, persistent hum that was starting to grow. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in her own family. I was a person who had a secret, and I was a person who was terrified of it being revealed. The call came 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. My mother, her voice a low, quiet hum, asked me to come home. "It's been so long, honey," she said, her voice a saccharine, fake sympathy. "We miss you. We want to see you." I was suspicious. My mother, a woman who had never missed me in her entire life, was now a woman who was a relentless, nagging presence in my life. "I can't," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm busy. I have work." "It's Thanksgiving," she said, her voice a low, accusing growl. "Family comes first. You have to do this for Lily. She's not doing so well. She wants to see you." I was a person who had been a prisoner of her own guilt, a person who had been a prisoner of her own past. And I was a person who was, in the end, a prisoner of her own heart. I couldn't say no to Lily. I couldn't say no to my sister. I was a person who had to go home. The dinner was a slow, agonizing descent into a familiar, painful hell. My parents were there, their faces a mask of forced smiles and quiet, persistent scrutiny. My brother, Mark, was there, his face a mask of a quiet, entitled expectation. And my sister, Lily, was there, her face a mask of a quiet, resigned despair. The conversation was stilted, painful. My parents would talk about Lily's health, her latest doctor's visit, her latest diagnosis. My brother, Mark, would talk about his life, his latest get-rich-quick scheme, his latest failure. And I would just sit there, a silent, solitary figure in a world of noise. The final straw came when Mark, in a fit of drunken entitlement, asked me for money. "You're a girl," he said, his voice a low, accusing growl. "You don't need a lot of money. I'm a man. I have a family. I need money." I just shook my head, a quiet, defeated gesture. "I'm not giving you any money, Mark," I said. "I'm not a bank." My mother, who had been a quiet observer, now spoke up. "You're a terrible daughter," she said, her voice a low, furious whisper. "You're a selfish girl. You have all this money, and you won't even help your family." My heart, which had been so full of a quiet, resigned despair, now felt a cold, quiet rage. "What money?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. "What are you talking about?" "The money you've been sending us," she shrieked. "The money you've been using to pay for Lily's medical bills. The money you've been using to pay for our mortgage. You're the anonymous benefactor. You're a liar. You're a thief. You've been lying to us for years." I was stunned. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own family, and I was now a person who was a ghost in her own home. The truth was out. The secret was revealed. The war had begun. The dinner table, which had been a place of quiet, painful stasis, was now a place of open, brutal conflict. My mother and father, the two people who had once been so oblivious to my existence, were now a loud, angry, accusatory presence in my life. "How could you lie to us?" my mother shrieked, her voice a high, furious squeal. "You've been rich all this time, and you've been letting us struggle." My brother, Mark, the golden child, was a man who was now full of a quiet, entitled fury. "You have to give me money," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have to give me a job. You have to help me. I'm your brother. You have to do this for family." I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in a world of greed and entitlement. I was a person who had been a prisoner of her own kindness, a person who was a prisoner of her own past. And I was a person who was, in the end, a person who was being betrayed. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, a constant, nagging presence in my life. My mother would call me, her voice a low, persistent whine. "We need a new car," she would say. "Our old one is breaking down. You have to buy us a new one." My father would call me, his voice a low, dismissive grunt. "Mark needs a job," he would say. "You have to use your connections to get him one. He's your brother. You have to do this for family." My brother, Mark, would call me, his voice a low, demanding growl. "I need a loan," he would say. "A big one. $100,000. You have to give it to me. You have to do this for family." I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in a world of greed and entitlement. My family, the people who had once been so oblivious to my existence, were now a loud, angry, demanding presence in my life. They were not my family. They were strangers. They were a virus, a persistent, relentless evil that I couldn't seem to shake. The final Thanksgiving was not a dinner. It was a war. I had a final, brutal, and very public confrontation with my family. I had driven home, a quiet, resolute girl, and I had walked into my parents' house, a place that was no longer a home, but a battlefield. I was a person who had a secret, and I was now a person who was a person who had a truth. My parents were there, their faces a mask of quiet, expectant triumph. My brother, Mark, was there, his face a mask of quiet, entitled rage. And my sister, Lily, was there, her face a mask of a quiet, resigned despair. I didn't say a word. I just walked into the living room, and I turned on the TV. I pulled up my bank account. I pulled up my business records. I pulled up my life. I showed them everything. The millions of dollars. The prestigious clients. The life I had built, a life that was a testament to my survival, a life that was a testament to my triumph. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in a world of truth. My parents, who had once been so oblivious to my existence, were now a loud, angry, and demanding presence in my life. They were not my family. They were strangers. They were a virus, a persistent, relentless evil that I couldn't seem to shake. My parents' faces, which had been a mask of quiet, expectant triumph, now turned to a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. My mother's face was a pale, terrified mask. My father's face was a mask of a quiet, defeated fury. My brother's face was a mask of a quiet, entitled rage. I had one. I had a truth. And I was not going to let them take it from me. I then showed them a list of every anonymous payment, every medical bill, every car payment. I showed them that I had been their lifeline, the ghost who had been keeping them afloat for years. Their faces, which had been a mask of quiet, expectant triumph, now turned to a mask of pure, unadulterated shame. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in a world of truth. My parents, who had once been so oblivious to my existence, were now a loud, angry, and demanding presence in my life. They were not my family. They were strangers. They were a virus, a persistent, relentless evil that I couldn't seem to shake. I looked at them, at their faces, at their quiet, confident entitlement, and I felt a cold, quiet rage. I was not a prisoner anymore. I was not the girl in the germ-free zone anymore. I was a woman who had earned her freedom, a woman who had fought for her life, a woman who had a truth. I'm not giving you any money, I said, my voice a low, quiet hum. I'm not giving you a new car. I'm not giving you a new life. I'm not giving you anything. You are a bunch of strangers who are trying to steal my house. You are a bunch of strangers who are trying to steal my life. You are a bunch of strangers who are trying to steal my peace. You are not my family. You are a bunch of parasites. I then walked out of the house, a quiet, resolute girl who was finally, truly, free. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, a constant, nagging presence in my life. My mother would call me, her voice a low, persistent whine. "We're so sorry, honey," she would say. "We're so sorry. We'll do anything. Please forgive us." My father would call me, his voice a low, dismissive grunt. "You're being a little dramatic, aren't you?" he would say. "Family comes first. You have to do this for Lily." My brother, Mark, would call me, his voice a low, demanding growl. "I need a loan," he would say. "A big one. $100,000. You have to give it to me. You have to do this for family." I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in a world of truth. My family, the people who had once been so oblivious to my existence, were now a loud, angry, and demanding presence in my life. They were not my family. They were strangers. They were a virus, a persistent, relentless evil that I couldn't seem to shake. I blocked their numbers. I blocked their emails. I blocked their social media accounts. I was a person who had been a prisoner of her own kindness, and I was now a person who was a prisoner of her own truth. The road to healing was long and difficult. I had a lot of guilt. I had a lot of pain. I had a lot of resentment. I had a lot of anger. I was a person who had been a ghost in her own life, and I was now a person who was a ghost in a world of truth. I started seeing a therapist, a kind, quiet woman who listened to my story without judgment or pity. She taught me that my past didn't have to be my future, that I could heal, that I could move on, that I could be a whole, healthy person. She taught me that my worth was not determined by my family's opinion of me. She taught me that I was a person who was a success, a person who was a triumph, a person who was a person. I was a person who had been a prisoner of her own guilt, and I was now a person who was a prisoner of her own truth. I was a person who was learning to be happy, a person who was learning to be a person who was learning to be a person who was not defined by her family. I am no longer a ghost. I am a person. I am a person who is a success, a person who is a triumph, a person who is a person. I have a new apartment, a new life, and a new sense of purpose. I am a person who is a master of her craft, a person who is a master of her own life. I have a new family, a family of friends, a family of people who love me, a family of people who support me. I have a family of people who see me, not as a ghost, but as a person. I am a person who has learned that the most important thing in life is not money or success or a big house. It's freedom. It's peace. It's the knowledge that you are a person who can stand up for herself, a person who can fight for her life, a person who can say no. My story is not just a story of a woman who was neglected. It's a story of a woman who was betrayed, a woman who was used, a woman who was manipulated. It's a story of a woman who was a ghost in her own home, and a woman who was a ghost in her own family. But it's also a story of hope, a story of resilience, a story of a woman who found her voice, a woman who found her power, a woman who, against all odds, found a way to be a person. I am a person who has a truth, a person who has a life, a person who has a future. And in the end, that was the most valuable thing of all. I haven't talked to my parents in years. I haven't talked to my brother, Mark, in years. I haven't talked to my sister, Lily, in years. I am a person who has a quiet, persistent hum of peace in her life, a quiet, persistent hum that I am not going to let anyone, not even my family, take from me. I recently saw a picture of my sister, Lily, on social media. She looked happy. She looked healthy. She looked like she was living her life. I felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. My story is not a story of a woman who was neglected. It's a story of a woman who was betrayed. But it's also a story of a woman who was a ghost in her own life, and a woman who was a ghost in her own family. I am a person who has a truth, a person who has a life, a person who has a future. And in the end, that was the most valuable thing of all. I have a quiet, persistent hum of peace in my life, a quiet, persistent hum that I am not going to let anyone, not even my family, take from me. My life is my own. And in the end, that was the most important thing of all. I am a person who has a truth, a person who has a life, a person who has a future. And in the end, that was the most valuable thing of all. I am a person who has a truth, a person who has a life, a person who has a future. And in the end, that was the most valuable thing of all.